Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the National Book Festival, what I like to refer to as one of my favorite days of the year. We are so lucky this morning to be hearing from both Ron and Scott, and just to get this out of the way from the beginning, both of these books are excellent. When I got them delivered to me, I read them so quickly I couldn't put them down, and you know that's an indicator of a terrific story and a great book. So we're going to have a conversation here today, and then we're going to have plenty of time at the end for audience questions because I know we have a lot of their fans in the audience. Our first question really is for both of you. Now, these are very different books, but there is common themes to both of them. I was actually astounded by how many common themes there were after I read both of them. To start us off, because there's probably some people here who have read your book, but maybe others who have not, can you both give us a little bit of a synopsis of the book and talk about the first theme that I found in common, which I like to call family is complicated.
Well put.
Scott, can you kick us off?
Well, I call this the radio speech, meaning you often show up when you're on book tour to a radio station where the host will, before you go on the air, will suddenly confess, I really haven't read this book, so I'm going to start out asking you to tell us what it's about.
I just assume.
Yeah, so Presumed Guilty, which is actually the third book I have written about Rusty Savage, who was the hero of Presumed Innocent and has been portrayed by both Harrison Ford and Jake Gyllenhaal. Probably a better fate than many heroes on the page receive. Rusty is now at the beginning much older, 76, 77, and after coming to a sort of full stop in his life, he's retreated to this rural area in what can be recognized as southern Wisconsin. He's fallen in love with a woman who's a good deal younger than he is, and everything in his life seems to be content, except that her son is one of the terms of his probation on a drug selling offense. He has been required to live with them and keep up with them. And the novel opens when the son disappears. And turns out that he was with this brilliant, eccentric girlfriend who never comes back from this trip. And suspicion about her disappearance soon focuses on the son.
The Savage Noble Death of Babs Dionne, give away a little bit in the title, obviously. It's about, anybody here know what a Franco-American is, first of all? Okay, you're the one.
There was somebody over there, too.
So Babs is, like me, Babs is Franco-American, which means that she is the descendant of mill workers who emigrated from largely Quebec to New England, specifically central Maine, where I grew up. And she is, she's a grandmother, a meme in our dialect, a mother, and the regional drug dealer.
Just like all of our grandmothers.
Which, I mean, that's actually one of the things that we could get into, but my wife liked to say, because my grandmother and her friends, oh, sorry, I'm synopsizing the book. Hold on. So Babs, at the beginning of the book, her youngest daughter, Sis, has gone missing, which is the central mystery of the story, what happened to Sis. At the same time, a mysterious stranger known only as the Man has come to town, and he is an emissary from a much larger drug dealer who wants to know why his business is down in central Maine, and intends to take over Babs's business. And she's the sort of person who, no matter how advisable it is to back down, compromise, etc., she never will. And so it's evident what's going to happen between those two, an immovable object and irresistible force. The other character that the story features is Babs' daughter, Lori, who's a 3-tour veteran of Afghanistan, who's suffering from a pretty healthy case of PTSD and also sees ghosts. And we come to understand through the story that the ghosts that she sees are in fact real. And that figures into the story as well. I don't want to ruin it, but you can guess from the title how it ends.
And Laurie also has got a pretty serious drug habit, too.
Yes.
She is an addict as well, which is a theme, obviously, in the book.
So Scott, as you said, this is the third book for Rusty. And as a writer, can you talk to us a little bit about both the advantages and the challenges of writing recurring characters in a series?
Well, when I published Presumed Innocent, which I talked about last night, is like riding a rocket ship. It was an amazing experience to go from your basement to the top of bestseller lists. I was absolutely determined that I was not going to get pigeonholed by writing another book about Rusty Savage. I didn't want to be the author of a series. I'd spent, many years, certainly 20 years, trying to publish a novel, and I guess actually learning a lot along the way. But I didn't want to do it. And then 20 years later, I was ready to write about Rusty again, and I did. And the theme of that novel, which is called Innocent, is, why in the world is it that we sometimes seem to make the same stupid mistakes and suffer the same way? But the Rusty comes to such a sad conclusion in that book. His wife is dead. He's been released from prison. Got a lot, that's not going right in his life, that I didn't want to leave him there because, as I say, Rusty Savage, because of his role in Presumed Innocent, really was the man who changed my life. And so I felt I owed him better.
A better ending, okay. That's great.
And so, was your intention to never write about him again, originally, after the first book?
I probably was young enough then to think that that's what I meant.
That's a great answer.
I learned as time went on that you should not set aside the things in yourself that you cherish.
Right.
And Rusty's voice was both still the most natural thing to me. And because of that, the vehicle through which I felt I'd finally been able to grab hold of a lot of what I always wanted to do as a writer. And so I should have known better than to say never. But at the time, my path, like virtually most writers who are here this week, there are very few Mozarts in the world of literature. And everybody's worked like hell and suffered a lot of rejection. And having gone through that, I was like, I'll be damned if I'm, going to be, one-trick pony.
Ron, you started to answer this when you're talking about your book, the synopsis, so we should delve into this. The book is so unusual, talking about this character, Babs Dionne, and her family. What was the inspiration for this book? Tell us how you came to write it. Is this a personal journey? Give us some idea.
Sure. There are a bunch of different ways to answer that question. The way that I've been answering it sort of allows a little bit of insight into how the novelist's mind works or fails to. You take things in, and sometimes you recognize that it might be something that you're going to make use of, but you don't know when or how. So I grew up in a neighborhood where everybody spoke French. It was extremely Catholic, in a sort of the Catholicism that we practice was a lot like the Catholicism in Gabriel Garcia Marquez's work, if any of you have read him, where it has a healthy sort of pagan element to it. And that made its way into the book too. But so this little world that I grew up in, which I call Little Canada in the book, my generation was the one that straddled the line between when that world was still in existence and very palpable and very vibrant, and the now when it disappeared entirely. Language is gone, culture is gone, we're completely anglicized and secularized. And as such, I think my generation of Francos feel, or certainly I don't want to speak for anybody else, but I felt as though that world was like a phantom limb, where it itched and it hurt, but it wasn't there anymore. And my memories got more and more slippery, and I started having moments when I thought, was any of that real? And so then I wanted to write about it for various reasons. But stories, and I'm assuming, Scott, you'll agree with me on this, but maybe you don't. Stories don't properly begin with wishes to write about something, and they don't necessarily begin with premises, they begin with characters. And I didn't have the right character. And then two things happened. The first was my aunt told me about how when she was a kid growing up, this is my dad's mom, or my dad's sister, when they were kids growing up in the 40s and into the 50s in Waterville, Maine, where I'm from, all the cops had a big key ring, cops that walked the beat, and they had the keys to every business in town, including the businesses in the Franco part of town, ostensibly so that they could let themselves into businesses and see that everything was on the up and up, but you can probably guess what they were actually doing most of the time, which was helping themselves to whatever they wanted. And so my aunt knew whenever she got a gift from this uncle of hers that was a cop, that it was stolen. She
Was
always
a re-gift.
Yes, it was regifted. That he never paid for it, whatever it might have been. So that went in the hopper, right? And then the other thing was I had a sort of recovered memory, and I can't believe I'm saying this for posterity, of my grandmother, my Meme Currie, who I was super close with as a kid, taking somebody's cat and putting it in a dryer and turning it on. That is the appropriate reaction. My memory is that the cat was okay, though I imagine he's no longer with us now. This is a long time ago. But it was one of those moments, and I think we all have them when you're real young, and I was young. I was like 5, 6, 7 in that range. When you have those starburst moments when you realize that the adults in your orbit, the people who care for you, if you're lucky, are not demigods. That in fact they're deeply flawed, sometimes violent, sometimes they do things that are bad. And that memory, when it came back to me, was sort of emblematic of a toughness that Franco women had to be possessed of in order to navigate and help their families navigate a world that was largely indifferent to them at best and openly hostile a lot of times. And so somehow those two things together gifted me the persona of Babs. She suddenly sprang from that. And then I was off and running. Oftentimes when you find, especially when you're really ready to write something and you're just waiting for the person to show up,
Right.
When that character shows up, if you're lucky enough for them to show up, you're ready to go.
That's great.
I have to add, as somebody who spent last week with Babs Dionne, and hugely enjoyed her company.
She's fun.
Yeah, she's fun, but the life of poor French Canadians was something I was vaguely acquainted with. But whenever I read and admire somebody else's work, I'm looking for the thing that I've never seen before. And in Babs Dionne, what you've really got are female gangsters, and
Female elderly gangster.
I remember this crazy movie with Sharon Stone years ago where there was supposed to be 4 female gunslingers, and you were like, "Give me a break."
Yeah, yeah.
But this is completely compelling and convincing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank
Scott, when I read Presumed Guilty, I decided to go back and I reread Presumed Innocent because it's been a while, and then I figured, well, what the heck, I'm just going to do the whole trilogy. So I spent a lot of time with Rusty in particular, and this trilogy that you've written. I realized partway into maybe the second book that I was reading that you're telling terrific stories. as a legal thriller writer, but you're also trying to teach us about the criminal justice
Yeah.
system. That's a component. So how do you do that as a novelist when you're trying to provide knowledge about something that people who aren't lawyers to understand, and also tell a good story? How do you balance that?
Well, I was a federal prosecutor for many years and then a criminal defense lawyer for many more. And that stuff is so intense when, another human being's liberty is at stake, whether you're the prosecutor or the defense lawyer, that it is deeply etched. It's part of your DNA. As I say, I often find myself in nightmares screaming objection as if I was in court. So it's pretty natural to me to talk in those terms. And the one vow I made myself when I started working on Presumed Innocent was that I was not going to bastardize the system in order to present it. And the reason was that what happens in a criminal courtroom, and just to say somebody's liberty is at stake, it's dramatic enough that you don't have to cut corners. Now, doing that in a way that is not boring
Right.
is sometimes difficult. And I have to say that between the time that I started Presumed Innocent, which is probably 1979 or 1980, and the time when I started writing Presumed Guilty, that there's been huge changes in what Americans know about their legal system. So in some ways it was not as heavy a lift this time around, and I felt I'd get more patience out of the audience because there was curiosity and knowledge on my side.
Ron, Scott said when he reads a book, he thinks about what is unusual or new in this book. And for me, when I read your book, it was, even though we are on, and this is sort of a little ironic to me, we are on the genre stage here, but I could not think about what genre to put your book in. There's so many different elements of noir, elements of literary fiction, even I would say elements of humor. It's a murder mystery. It's all those things wrapped into one. So can you talk to us, did you deliberately set out to do that? And is that challenging as an author in the publishing world today to cross over genres?
It is. The end. Yeah, I mean, full disclosure, Colleen and I were talking about this beforehand. I had reached a point in my life as both an author and as a consumer of stories, which I am principally still. I think of myself as a reader before a writer, where I had grown really impatient with what seemed to me to be the infantilization of American audiences, and the idea that stories need to be boiled down to some reductive designation. And I get the utility of that, both for the reader and for the publisher and everybody else. But it delimits the possibilities for what you can do as a writer and what you would engage with as a reader. I can't tell you how many times people have come up to me or written to me with this book and said, I don't normally read this sort of thing, whatever that means, but and so. My perspective as a writer now is I want to create a story that operates on any number of different levels. You can read it and have a blast for 2.5 hours and never think about anything more profound than Babs beating the ever-loving crap out of her son-in-law, right? Yeah. But you can also read it for the history that it encompasses. You can also read it for the contemplation of what family is and does. You can read it for hopefully a little taste of what I'm always looking for in stories is some surprising and enervating sense of what it is to be human, which is sometimes ugly, right? And so I think basically, to sum up, I think we all should be demanding more from our stories. We shouldn't settle for stories that either demand or expect us to turn our brains off for 2 hours in order to have a good time, or read an 800-page book in which nothing in particular happens just because it's important, right? And so I wanted to write a story that did all of that in a way, and also demonstrates that those things aren't mutually exclusive.
Right. So let's go back to some questions for both of you that tries to integrate some of the themes from both of the books. Sure. Go ahead,
I'm going to
Scott,
jump
sorry.
off on that because I have a slightly different take than Ron. And I started out, first as a college English major, and I ended up out at Stanford as a writing fellow in the Stegner program. And a lot of that time was spent talking about the purposes of fiction, a lot of what we would now call literary theory being tossed around. And finally, after years of that, I ended up pleasantly at odds with one of the revered professors there who was a champion of André Gide and the new novel. And, and the emblematic slogan was that of Pound, that the poet is the antenna of the race. So, fiction and literature is like this engine for receiving communication about, the epic changes in human condition. And I knew there was something wrong with that, and I found out eventually that Pound had said the poet is the antenna of the race, and thus he will never be understood by the bullet-headed many. And at that point I said, okay, that's not what I want to be as a writer. And I was standing in a criminal courtroom as a prosecutor, and I suddenly said, wait a minute, this is how you write a book that's pleasing to both an English professor and, say, a bus driver. And but my goal is, frankly, I'm just as happy with the people who want to read for a few hours for story.
Sure.
And, the people who say, they're more engaged by the psychological realism. That's, and of course, why? Because, as you imply, the 2-hour reader will, we suspect, eventually get tired of that and want more. And even if they don't, I'm pleased to be the vehicle.
Absolutely, yeah.
So both of these books deal with justice. I mean, these are both books about justice. So can you tell us what conception of justice do you think your book espouses? It's a toughie. Like what is, and I thought about it when I read both of these books, I thought, yeah, this is about justice, but there's many, many different definitions of justice, right? You learn that in a philosophy class or anything. So what's the conception of justice that you're trying to write about, espouse,
Well, my conception...
deal with?
I'm sorry. My conception of justice is candidly pretty legalistic. And it's whether, the criminal justice system can ever be relied upon to deliver an accurate judgment about another human being. And, and I think Presumed Guilty, and probably all of my other novels, explore the overwhelming fallibilities of the system that we have. But our criminal justice system is, very much like Churchill's remarks about democracy. It really stinks, except compared to
everything else.
every other system.
Right.
And at the end of Presumed Guilty, Rusty kind of engages in a brief soliloquy about the fact that, for better or for worse, his entire adult life has been engaged with the law and the criminal justice system. And his ultimate conclusion is that it's been an okay way to spend a life, and that he's learned a lot about human beings along the way. But he thinks that for all its failures, the law is a noble institution.
Yeah, well, I was getting ready for this this talk, I was thinking about those sorts of thematic preoccupations in your books, particularly with Rusty. And it occurred to me that, it's about the clash. This is something I'm really interested in as a layman, which is the clash between the vagaries of human behavior and the sort of the strictures of the legal system that can it ever successfully encounter and pass judgment on the vagaries of human behavior. Do you think that that's possible?
Well, and I think this is really responsive to the question. You become acquainted after years of practicing law with the fact that there is a range of outcomes that are just. And with the trial, for example, that's in presumed guilty, I wanted it to be the case that both a guilty and a not guilty verdict seem reasonable. Now that's really disconcerting to lay people.
Right.
And yet, if the system operates the way it's supposed to, and the evidence has been fairly presented, and it's not a case of just hauling an innocent person in off the street because you don't like, for example, in presumed guilty, you don't like the color of the skin. But instead, there's a reasonable basis for this person to be on trial in the first place, then you have to accept the fact that, a well-intentioned jury, may come back and say guilty. There are plenty of cases where either not guilty or guilty are, that's an irrational conclusion. But sometimes both conclusions are possible. And then you have to stand back and go, okay, that's the way this system is meant to function. And then the difficult part, and I guess that's okay with me.
Okay. Another theme between both of the books is the role of community. Both of these books are set in very tight-knit communities. As you said, Scott, your book revolves around race and conceptions of the other revolving around race. And Ron, your book, with ethnicity, religion, this very tight-knit community in Maine. So talk about how that factored into your book. It's also writing about how these communities function and injustices or justices that happen within that type of community.
Well, I'm going to talk about Ron's book for just a second, because, one of the things that I liked about this book is that it was a reminder for all of our talk about white privilege, that in point of fact, there are plenty of poor white people in the United States who have spent their lives being stepped on. And it's, of course, it's within the nature of all human beings that we kind of define our community often in the light of oppression. The fact that we've had a common enemy somehow ends up binding us together, and the memory of the injustices, which lingers for generations. I found myself in Presumed Guilty writing about this peculiar community in southern Wisconsin, where I've spent time for more than 30 years now, and never been a part of. But I've been an observer. And, this is a rural / ex-urban area, and there are a lot of angry people there. The farmers who feel that they've basically been ignored by all the politicians, and it took me a while to say, yeah, they have good reason to feel that way. They're angry, and they deserve to be angry because they keep getting the short end of the stick. And for that reason, there are resemblances between these two communities. This community, and it's a little like the Waterville of Ron's book, it does contain economic extremes, and there's a part of Waterville where the rich people live, and there's a part of Skagen County, where the rich go to spend their summers. So the contrast is there as well.
I think we're only interesting insofar as we're in relation to one another in terms of story, right? My brain immediately went to Castaway with Tom Hanks.
Oh,
Like even he needed a buddy
Right.
for that story to work. You know what I mean? He needed somebody to be in relation with. So I think community as a driver of story is essential. And Scott made really smart and really cogent observations about how community is so often forged, or a sense of belonging to a community and a sense of loyalty to that community is so often forged by.
And also fear of the other, right?
There's definitely an ugly side to it. There's no question. And
Right.
in Maine, we somewhat jokingly, but with genuine derision, sometimes refer to people who aren't from Maine as from away, right? And you have to. This is legit. You have to go back 6 or 7 generations to be considered an actual Mainer, right? And there's something silly about that, but there's also something very serious about the bonding that it produces. Maine and this story and the 2 books that follow it in the series encompass a lot of the history of the place, as Maine was part of Massachusetts for a very long time. And it's a place where natural resources have been extracted and exploited, and the money from the revenue from that exploitation has been largely siphoned off into other places for generation upon generation upon generation. I think that informs both the community and the story, but also just the way that we are in our orientation toward the world today. Our suspicion of outsiders.
Both books are also, the crimes in the books are driven by drug abuse or drug use. So talk about why did you choose to include that as one of the main drivers of the crime in your books?
Oh, I don't know what the percentage is, and I will say something that's not correct, which is that when I started doing pro bono work and sat in the state criminal courtroom, I was a creature of the federal courts, which principally prosecute in Chicago white-collar crime. All of a sudden, I'm going to go in at the invitation of a judge out there, and at the Circuit Court of Cook County, I'm going to begin doing pro bono work with street crime. And sitting in those courtrooms, just trying to learn what was going on, there were 2 things that were commonplace, one of which is not written much about or talked much about, and that is the sexual abuse of children. And it's very unsettling to realize how prevalent that behavior is. The other, of course, is drugs. And, when you talk about the reason that rich people commit crime, you can start with greed. And I suppose poor people, too, commit crimes for economic reasons, but more often, drugs are at the root of it, and the inability to control yourself that drugs create. And by the way, it's also, I think, from a social policy level, I've spent my life kind of thinking about this. It's very hard to know what the right answer is. And does legalization, for example, which is something I thought I completely favored at one point, does legalization make the problem better or worse? But you legalize, then by definition, people are not criminals when they're using. That's good. But are you making that behavior more widespread? And then the difficult issue for me is, what do you do about kids?
In my case, as a storyteller, I'm interested in the larger forces at work that wind up in a situation where a very particular individual is addicted to oxycodone or heroin or whatever. So like, consider, for example, that the longest war in the history of this country took place in the country where the majority of poppies, which is of course the base for opioids, are grown. How does that have, what sort of effect does that have on where and how much we use a particular drug when we are spending so much money, when we have such a huge presence in that place? And Lori, the daughter of Babs, is as I said, she did 3 tours in Afghanistan. It's where she picked up her habit, as a lot of soldiers did. And to me, there's no way, the book is set in 2016, there's absolutely no way to write a story in Maine or probably anywhere in America in 2016 that doesn't engage, at least in a glancing way, with the opioid epidemic.
Well, that I thought was, and that's the point, and the point of the question in some ways is that you can go to Ohio, you can go to Kentucky, you can go, you can go to New Mexico, wherever you go, and particularly among the white underclass, you know, opioid use and opioid abuse was, you know, a common theme. So it's, it's, in some ways, it's just hard to figure out. Why did it happen that way everywhere? And it would be cowardly if you had not portrayed that.
Yeah, I mean, you just wouldn't buy it. You shouldn't buy it if I tried to sanitize the story in that way. But I'm interested in the second book, which I've finished recently. Babs has a conversation with her friend Rita, her adopted sister Rita, and they're much younger in this book, and they're talking about the very simple equation for poor people regarding committing crime, which is, it's a simple cost-benefit analysis. Will it cost you more? Will it more likely cost you more than it benefits you, or vice versa? And that's how, without actually doing the math and thinking about it consciously, that's how a lot of poor people end up engaged in crime to begin with, which is, it's another way of saying if you've got nothing to lose, you know, you've got nothing to lose.
Why do you think Babs is a drug dealer, but her daughter has a drug problem? So how does that square?
How does she square it?
Yeah, how does she square it? How do you square it? How do you think about that?
It's possible that Babs has the same sort of attitude that my father. I can't believe I'm going to drag my dad into this. He's been gone for almost 20 years. He can't defend himself. But I think she has largely the same attitude in that do what you will. You know, at a certain point in your life, I love, as much as Babs loves Lori and as much as my father loved me, do what you will. But the other side of it, and Babs actually talks about this pretty explicitly in the book, where she sees what she does not as dealing, but as regulation, right? So she determines which drugs do and do not come into her neighborhood. She determines who has access to them. She determines what they're sold for. She determines for whom access is revoked, all of those things, right? And she does that on a microcosmic scale, where I think you could make a convincing argument that she does it successfully within that confusing context that you were talking about.
And I thought, reading the novel, that was clearly bullshit, since both of her daughters are drug addicts. And she hasn't done a very good job of regulating, even within the walls of her own home.
Sure.
The problem has become destructive.
Yeah, and Lori says to her, it's not in the book, but it's something that's between them, where Lori says, you want me addicted, you need me addicted, it keeps me under your thumb.
Right.
Like you are a junkie's dream, unlimited free dope. And this is sort of news to Babs. I mean, she's sort of shocked by it, even though it's so self-evidently true.
I'm sure we have a lot of questions from the audience, so I'm going to ask my last question if you want to start to line up to ask both of these authors your questions. But people love to know, what are you working on now? What's next?
I'm working on a novel which is historical. I'm kind of kind of in the same position as Ron. You know, when your characters become decrepit or dead, you want to talk about them. You got to go back in time. So that's where I am. I'm writing a book set in 1962, where Rusty Savage's defense lawyer, Sandy Stern, is one of the principal characters.
But it's also really interesting, and I think it opens up an opportunity that we don't normally have to take the context of what we understand about who somebody became and see who they were before some of these things happened, and have an understanding of them as younger people with that the context of who they became and how they behaved later on. That sort of reverso is really interesting to me as a storyteller.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that Sandy talks about, and this is really a conversation with his daughter, who's been his law partner for years, but one of the things he finds himself confessing is how anxious he was as a young person, and how the anxiety he felt, which was quite reasonable given his personal circumstances, ended up driving his behavior. And that's probably not something that he recognized, certainly before he reached the age of 94.
Sure, yeah.
Do we have questions? If you come up to the microphone, they're on both sides here of the aisle, and we just ask if you pull that microphone close to you so that our recording is able to capture your question. So we'll start over here.
Hello. Wow, what a wonderful day we've had here. I want to talk to you as authors, because you mentioned ghosts, and it triggered me, because I grew up with ghosts. Casper the Friendly Ghost. So I want to know, how you decided to use ghost as a device to tell a story, and what was your motivation for that way of getting your point across? Thank you.
Sure. Thanks for the question. From my perspective, it was a very simple. I had a narrative dilemma that I had to figure out, which is how to successfully dramatize grief. Because grief isn't inherently dramatic. It's quiet. It happens on the individual level largely, and it's just not particularly useful for a story. It's the same challenge of writing about climate change. Climate change is not inherently dramatic, and I have experience writing about that as well. So it struck me that being haunted is very similar. I think we probably, as a species, came up with the idea or the concept of haunting as a metaphor for grief, right? Like, you're the only person who's aware of it. If you become too preoccupied with it, people think you're crazy. And we're all carrying around our ghosts in this room, right? We all have our measure of it. And so, it was simply just a way to dramatize that grief that we all carry around, and that grief, which for Laurie is dramatically important. She has ghosts from all over, from her time in country in Afghanistan, to her family at home and otherwise. So, it's just dramatized grief, essentially.
Can I ask a question? How many people in this room believe in ghosts? That is, the physical presence of people who are supposedly dead. Yeah, it's a relatively small number. And I'm with the majority. I don't, as much as, I'm reading another novel now with great inscription from Thornton Wilder, which is that there's a bridge between the living and the dead, and that bridge is love. And that's true. And there are many people who are gone who I love desperately. But I don't see them as having a physical presence in my life. The caveat that, and I've thought a lot about this because we spend time in Florida now, and one of my wife's and now my dear friends is a medium. And she is a no bullshit human being. When she tells you that so-and-so is in the room, she means it. And I've been struggling to explain how Elaine can do this and what it means. And my latest fabrication to myself is that she's not really seeing ghosts. What she's reading is you and what you want to believe and who you want to see. But probably pretty flimsy. And she's astonishingly accurate. And again, this is not a carnival trick.
Over here.
Great, yeah, you all kind of collectively mentioned the part that your work plays in educating people about the judicial system. Having lived in Latin America where there are real problems in judicial systems, I have to say it's probably a greater service than many even realize. But I wanted to see if you take that ever one step further and say, you know, there's something really messed up in our system that I'd like to expose, and then build a piece of the novel or a piece of a story or a character around that to kind of bring that to the fore.
Well, complicated answer. When I started doing street crime, it was inevitable that I ended up representing murderers, and as a further step, that I would end up having to deal with capital punishment, the death penalty. But I always believe that the role of fiction is to deal, you know, Faulkner's great phrase, the human heart in conflict with itself. You're dealing with ambiguities in fiction, almost always. And thus, I don't believe that, you know, it's the job of fiction. Like, I'm not Zola. I'm telling stories. And so I don't remember which Hollywood studio head who told one of his writers, if you want to send a message, use Western Union. And so but you know, what I was experiencing representing people on death row was very compelling. So first I wrote a novel and called Reversible Errors. And then when I finished it, I realized, okay, that this is not everything I want to say. And I ended up doing a long article for the New Yorker about my own experience with capital punishment, and then that became a book. But that dichotomy between the fiction, which is not there to propose answers or ask questions, and the nonfiction is still distinct to me.
Okay.
Do you mind if I ask what book you're reading now that has that inscription by Thornton Wilder?
The author's name is McConaughey, and if I take my phone out of my pocket, if I didn't turn it off, and I didn't, we'll go on to somebody else, and then I'll interrupt and tell you what it is. Wild Dark Shore by Charlotte McConaughey.
Okay. My real question is about your novel, Ordinary Heroes. It's not a legal novel, but it is thrilling, and it is a wonderful novel. And I'm just interested in the transition that you made from one novel to another, since you were talking about not doing the same thing every time.
Yeah. Well, Ordinary Heroes is really, was my effort to deal with my dad. And my dad, like all of our fathers, was a complicated guy. He had a pretty dark side. And what was strange to me was that my father, who I frankly hated at moments, as did my sister, had this glorious record during World War II. And I wondered how he had summoned the best of himself at that particular point in time. And the short, disquieting answer is that when I began reading his letters, and he was a terrific writer, by the way, which also a shock to me, but he sometimes wrote my mother 4 times a day, and she kept all the letters. The disquieting answer was that this glorious war record was largely fabricated. I think I know why he did it, and even more complicated, he was, by my lights, a hero. He had done, he was a field surgeon. He wanted to go to the front. He wanted to be on death's doorstep, and he did. And why that person felt the need to glorify what he'd actually done was beyond me. But so it was this incredibly complicated set of personal facts and these demons I was trying to exorcise in writing this novel about World War II, which I'll beg to differ just a little bit. I mean, ultimately, the plot engine is trying to figure out how the narrator's father ended up being court-martialed at the end of the war. So there is a little bit of a legal hook there. But, this is one of the books I've written that I'm always most delighted when people bring up, and inevitably the readers, not inevitably, but very often they tend to be the children of soldiers who found this description of that experience particularly moving. So thank you for asking.
Thank you.
So myself, I'm trying to venture into the thriller genre of writing. What advice can you just give to someone like myself who wants to make this? Because I have a very good idea, I just don't know what the best suggestion to go with it is.
Well, if you have an idea, my answer is put your bottom in a chair
That's right.
and start writing.
That's right.
Years ago, I got a fan letter from Phil Knight at Nike, and I told him he had stolen the writer's slogan, which is just do it. So the most important thing is start writing. And frankly, if you write a good book, particularly in this genre, you have a better chance than somebody who wants to write a book in the mode of James Joyce of getting it published. So I would just encourage you to go ahead. I know Ron has done both screenwriting and novel writing, probably has more to say.
No, pretty much. I mean, it's
Yeah.
no, it's labor like any other, and you either get it done or you don't.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very simple. Beyond that, though, I would encourage you to develop an appreciation for delayed gratification. And it's funny, but it's not untrue. Novels are a long haul, and the daily work of putting together a long-form story can be, particularly when you are just starting out, and the world gives you any number of reasons to doubt whether or not what you're doing is worthwhile. And that continues, actually. You have to be able to continue working in the face of the fact that you've got nothing to show for it.
Yeah, I always say that almost everybody I know who succeeded in any of the arts has demonstrated an ability to take a punch.
Oh, yeah.
And you've got to be able to get up and go back to it. And you'll find out. You'll find out pretty soon how much it means to you, because there's going to be rejection, there's punishment of all kinds, people laugh at you. You're a writer? Ha, ha, ha.
Yeah.
So.
How
Yep.
nice for you that you're
Right, yeah.
Hello. I have a process question about Suspect and Ordinary Heroes. I think where both of those manuscripts were very enjoyable is they had mastered another generation's experience of the world. So I'm curious, like, what attitudes or process helped, helped you in writing those novels?
Well, in Ordinary Heroes, I had tremendous help from the fact that once you start poking around online, there's a lot of first-person accounts from soldiers in World War II, and that helped both with voice and detail. Suspect is written from the point of view of a 33-year-old bisexual female, and some of you may have noticed that I am not 33 years old or female. And I actually thought, just as you're asking, the toughest bridge to cross was age, because our lives are historically bound. And so I spent a lot of time listening, particularly to my stepdaughters, and I don't know how successful I was in absorbing their milieu, but at least I tried.
Thank you.
My question is more on a personal level. As you're writing and researching into some of the darker sides of the human experience, how do you keep yourself from becoming overwhelmed with it? And do you feel that in writing somehow you can speak into the darkness and kind of bring a resolution there through some of the conclusions of your novels?
Look, I spent 40 plus years involved in the criminal justice system. And I think I've been deeply exposed, not as a victim of it, but as an observer to human depravity. People can be awful, but they can also be great. And, that's the truth of life. I do believe in art, and art as a way to connect us all, and often to redeem. If you write a great book about a really dark crime, that by itself is really positive. And okay, I'll let the cat out of the bag. Nobody here will be surprised. I'm really depressed right now about where we are as a country. There's a lot of stuff going on that breaks my heart. But I do believe that Dr. King was right when he said that the arc of history bends toward justice. I believe it. I think it's palpably true. And so I just hope I live to see the better days.
Hi, thank you to you both. Ron, my question's for you. I'm married to a Mainer.
Please explain.
It takes some fortitude. No, he's from Lewiston. My in-laws live in Turner.
Yep.
My father-in-law works in the kitchens at Colby. It's easy for me as someone who's from away to read these books and say, oh yeah, this is me and I recognize, but it hits different for them. I gave The Burgess Boys by Elizabeth Strout to my mother-in-law, and then I live to regret it a little bit. So I want to know how it is for you. You live in the community. You write about it so honestly. What kind of feedback do you get from the community?
Yeah, I think by and large, Francos, at least in Maine, we have so little cultural visibility that I think everybody's just happy that somebody wrote a book about us, honestly. And then, I'm sure if I had private conversations with certain people, they would quibble with depictions. I know some people got got their hackles up over the depiction of Waterville as this, drug-riddled hellscape, which I would argue that's not how I portray it, but that's how people are seeing it. But that said, I think it's really hard to get two people who saw the same thing 5 minutes ago to agree on what happened, let alone an entire, ethnic group to agree on what that experience was over the course of several generations. So I'm not interested in trying to get it right in anybody's view. What I'm more interested in is that people recognize that there's an emotional truth to what I've written. And my experience with this book has been that people do recognize that, and not just Franco-Americans, but what I think of as East East Coast ethnics of all kinds, Italians, Irish, Jewish, I think to a certain extent, where Portuguese and so on, where we all had largely the same experience as immigrants do now. In Maine, it's immigrants and refugees from Francophone African countries who are on the short end of the stick at this point, right? So I'm after an emotional truth that I think is harder to palpate, but also indelible. And so I think I've hit that. Thanks.
Both Ron and Scott will be signing their books at 12:30 and downstairs, so urge you to, if you haven't bought them already, to go take the opportunity to buy these books and go down to visit them and have them sign them. Thank you so much, both of you. Thank you for a wonderful conversation. Thank you.